I'll do that now.
Okay, lovely.
And welcome to all of the people who are piling in on this balmy Brisbane evening.
Yeah, look at all of these lovely faces. It's great to have so many cameras switched on.
Yeah.
More people here. Okay, lovely. Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. This evening we have Krissy Kneen in conversation with Merlin Sheldrake, discussing Merlin's book, Entangled Life, how fungi makes our worlds, change our minds, and shape our futures. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently broadcasting from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before I hand you over to our speakers this evening, I'd just like to quickly reiterate some of the information that you were sent in the email with your link to join tonight's event. So you've all automatically been placed on mute and you will remain so throughout the evening, but that doesn't mean that we won't be having a Q&A session at the end. It will just look a little bit different to how you might expect. So if you look towards the bottom left of your screen, you should see a box for a chat box. If you click on that, it'll open it up and you can send messages to me using that function. If you type your questions in there, then they'll come directly through to me and I'll read them out along with your name later on in the evening when we hand over to questions. So I'd also like to mention that we have a special promotion on at the moment, which is that everybody who attends our events can receive 10% off their book orders made on our website. So if you want to benefit from that discount, then you can use the code EVENT, E-V-E-N-T, at checkout to receive 10% off. I'll be posting the link to purchase your copies of Entangled Life in the chat box shortly. So I recommend getting in quickly to make the most of that discount. And so I'd now like to introduce Merlin Sheldrake. Merlin is a fungal biologist and a writer. He received a PhD in tropical ecology from Cambridge University for his work on underground fungal networks in tropical forests in Panama, based at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. In 2016, he was profiled in the New Yorker by Robert Macfarlane for an article about the Wood Wide Web. He is a musician and keen fermenter. Entangled Life is his first book. And in conversation with Merlin tonight, we have the wonderful Krissy Kneen. Krissy is the award-winning author of 8 long-form works of fiction, memoir, and poetry. She was shortlisted for the Stella Prize for her book An Uncertain Grace and won the Thomas Shapcott Award for Eating My Grandmother. She is the 2020 Copyright Agency Fellow for Creative Nonfiction, writing a book about the horrors and joys of human bodies, including her own. Her memoir about her Slovenian grandmother, The Three Burials of Lottie Kneen, will be released in May next year. And so, Krissy and Merlin, it is now my pleasure to hand over to you both for tonight's discussion.
Thanks very much, Kate. Now, I had a warning that my internet was having a little bit of trouble. Are you hearing me at all? That's okay?
Yeah,
great. I hate it when that warning pops up. Well, welcome, Merlin. It is my absolute pleasure to be talking to you tonight because this book is, it really did blow my mind. I'd like to, I think, introduce it by reading a little bit of a paragraph on the front of the book. You say in the book, as you read these words, fungi are changing the way that life happens, as they have done for more than 1 billion years. They are eating rock, making soil, digesting pollutants, nourishing and killing plants, surviving in space, inducing visions, producing food, making medicines, manipulating animal behaviour, and influencing the composition of the Earth's atmosphere. Fungi provide a key to understanding the planet on which we live and the ways we think, feel, and behave. This is quite a Pandora's box that you have opened for us on the page. And I wanted to know when you actually discovered the Pandora's box for yourself. Can you talk a bit about your original interest in fungi?
Yes. I've been always interested since I was a child. I remember being very interested in how things decompose, how things transform, and how does a log become soil? Um, how does compost become soil? And I was told at one point that these processes were overseen by invisibly small creatures with voracious appetites. And some of these creatures were fungi. And so I became very curious about these organisms that seemed to be responsible for so much, and yet lived their life so out of sight. And so that was one way in, this astonishment at a great metabolic power of these organisms. And another way in was through symbiosis and the study of the way that organisms are constantly inventing new ways to live alongside one another. And so my study of the symbiotic relationship between fungi and trees really led me very deep into this fungal world. And it was just I think many people who study fungi have this experience of this corridor with endless doors going off it, and you just start opening these doors and you just get lost in this kind of labyrinth of fascination and ever deepening curiosity. And so through this mycorrhizal world, these root fungi, and these relationships with plants, I just entered into the rabbit hole, you know, and I'm yet to emerge.
It is quite a rabbit hole, actually, and I brought my dinner here to start discussing fungi, because this is a particular specimen that might not look like the mushrooms that people are used to seeing, but I just thought I'd ask you about the different parts of fungi and what's going on here. What are we seeing, and what is it that we can't see?
Yeah, good question. So that's the lion's mane mushroom, which doesn't look like a normal mushroom, but it's a fruiting body nonetheless. And when we look at mushrooms, we're looking at the fruit of fungi. It's like looking at the apple or a peach on a tree. But most fungi live most of their lives as these branching, fusing networks of tubular cells known as mycelium, which is analogous to the tree itself. So imagine if all you knew of an apple tree were the apples it produced for a couple of weeks every year. And there'd be a lot that we would not be thinking about, a lot that we would not be observing. And so with fungi, it's similar. And so mycelium is how fungi feed. It's the way that they insinuate themselves into their source of food. Unlike animals put food in their bodies, fungi put their bodies in their food. And mycelium is a very efficient way to do so. But every now and then, periodically, they will fruit. They'll produce fruiting bodies like that amazing lion's mane mushroom that you see there. And the fruiting bodies where they produce spores and release spores. And spores are analogous to plant seeds, loosely analogous to plant seeds. They're how fungi disperse themselves. And their spore production is prolific. The spores, fungal spores, are the largest source of, or fungi are the largest source of living particles in the air. And spores account for, there's 50 million tons of fungal spores produced every year, and they end up in the atmosphere and they influence the weather. So spores are a very big part of fungal life, and they're produced by the fruiting bodies, and the fruiting bodies are themselves produced by the mycelial networks. And so a lot of what we talk about when we're talking about fungal behavior is actually in the mycelium, although a lot of what we know, maybe from our own experience, is in the mushroom form.
I thought it was fascinating to think that it could actually, the amount of spores in the air could actually influence the weather. It seems like something so tiny, yet has such a gigantic impact. And that's that kind of something to do with mushrooms, about there's so much of it that you don't see. And if you look down at the ground, it's actually, you know, like looking at the ocean in terms of the life under there and the mycelial life under there as well. I wondered, and one of the things that I've never quite understood is sex and mushrooms. So I thought I'd just ask you a little bit about that, because people, you know, you read about this idea that mushrooms don't have, you know, they're not a binary creature. They have many genders and they have many different forms of sexuality. Could you just elaborate on that? Because I've never quite understood that.
So the sex lives of fungi are Byzantine and diverse, and there's, of course, there's many ways to be a fungus. So this is a whole kingdom of life, and it's a very diverse kingdom of life. And so it's a huge topic. fungal sets. But broadly speaking, fungi have mating types, and so there's approximately equivalent to our sexes. But many types of fungus don't have just 2 mating types. As the record holder is a fungus that has 23,000 mating types. And so this really is quite dizzying. But there are different stages to fungal sets. So if you have 2 networks, say 2 mycelial networks, they might be able to, they've got to fuse with each other. The networks have to fuse with each other and share their cellular contents in order for the nuclei, the DNA containing nuclei, to be able to meet and recombine. So there's these 2 levels of compatibility. You can have networks that are compatible, but then they don't undergo nuclear sex, or you can have incompatible networks. Networks can fuse and then become incompatible. They can fuse and then kind of unfuse, or fuse and then block each other. And so there's just so many ways this can happen. So with truffles, for example, a fungus won't produce a truffle fungus, a truffle mycelium won't produce a truffle until it's met a partner of the opposite mating type, until they have fused, pooled their genetic information. One partner will play the maternal role, and will provide the flesh from which this truffle, the fruit, will develop. And one partner will play a paternal role and just supply genetic information and nothing more. But each mating type can play either the paternal or the maternal role. So a truffle fungus has to meet the opposite mating type, but whether you're with A or B mating type does not mean that it doesn't restrict your ability to play maternal or a maternal role. So it's a dizzying, complex world.
They are incredibly flexible in so many ways. I think flexibility seems to be the word that should be underlined when looking at mushrooms and looking at fungi. I'm also interested in the fact that something that is so, fleshy, and that you can I could snap that lion's mane with my fingers and tear it apart, and yet mushrooms can decompose rock and push up through concrete. What is happening here when mushrooms can be so, you can actually tear them, and yet they are so strong? How does that happen?
Yes, some they really play this shape-shifting, ambiguous card. The ink cap mushrooms are very good at this. They can push their way up through asphalt and lift paving stones, but you can then fry them up and eat them. There's sort of fleshy mushroom, familiar fleshy mushroom that we can eat. And if you leave it in a jar, it will start to deliquesce into this pitch black ink. This bright white flesh will turn pitch black and turn into liquid. The solid becomes liquid. So there's this astonishing sequence of events that really confuses our categories. But with the pushing up through paving stones and through asphalt, it's because fungal growth is driven by hydraulics. So when a mushroom inflates with water, there's this very powerful hydraulic force which allows it to push up through asphalt and lift up heavy paving stones. And on a much smaller level, when the edges of mycelial network are growing, when these growing tips are exploring their environment, they can generate enormous pressure and penetrate solid rock or plant cuticles. And so pressure is how they explore, is how they drive themselves forward into their environment. And it's a really important part of their life, because they have to be able to get inside their source of food, because they digest it once inside it. So it's one of their great habits.
You talked about the ink cap, and you have some pictures in the book. All the way through the book, there are these beautiful pictures. They are made with the ink made from fungi, aren't they? Can you talk about how those pictures came to be in the book?
Yes, well, so I found some ink cap mushrooms and picked them and ate some, and then left some to deliquesce to form this ink, and then gave this ink to a very amazing artist, a Canadian artist called Colin Elder, who then use this ink to draw these images. And one of my favorite ones is the picture of the ink cap drawn in ink cap ink. There's a kind of world looking at itself, circularity there. But I just wanted to keep as much contact with the fungal world as possible, and so this felt like a good way to do so.
It's a beautiful thing to do, because what this book is it's not just a science book. This book is a book that has a lot of you in it, and also a lot of philosophy in it. So how did you make that balance? How did you, what did you want to achieve by writing this book?
Well, it was a few things. I wanted to help alleviate our fungus blindness. This was the sort of challenge number one. And there's this term plant blindness that people use to describe the effect. And if you show an image of a bustling, a vegetational scene in a jungle with a little corner of a tiger or jaguar's tail peeking out between two palm fronds, and you ask someone what's happening in this picture, the person will usually talk about this little end of a jaguar's tail peeking out between two palm fronds. They won't talk about this hugely diverse plant scene. When people refer to this as plant blindness, it seems to be something that we're predisposed to notice animals and animal life, maybe because they're more likely to be predators and move quickly. But we also have a kind of fungus blindness, and our fungus blindness is more understandable because much of fungal life we simply can't see. So in writing this book, I wanted to open up this world a little bit so that we could become curious about it. It's very hard to be curious about something you don't know is there and don't know is going on. So on one level, I wanted to alleviate our fungus blindness. On another level, I wanted to draw attention to these shimmering networks of interconnection and interaction that we're bound up within, but that we too often don't notice. And because fungi form literal connections between organisms, it's really hard to avoid this sense of interconnection in the natural world. And so that was a bigger theme that was running through it. And also another part of it was to try and, I mean, for me, thinking about the fungi makes the world look different. And I wanted to use these organisms as a way to explore some of our well-worn categories, to explore some of the assumptions that we make about the living world, and maybe reveal some of our blind spots in the hope that we could learn to imagine more richly this, the way that we related to the world around us, the way that we form relationships to each other, and to try and decalcify maybe some of our dogmas. So that was another level. And so for it to work on all these levels, I really had to, it was not just about the basics of fungal biology, it's about how are they interacting with their surroundings, how are they interacting with all the other organisms, including us, and what effect do they have on us, how do they imprint on us and our behavior, and how can we see fungal life reflected in our own. And so it had to become philosophical and personal and social as well.
Let's start with the science in the book. So you were studying mycology, but there wasn't a department of mycology at the university. And why is that? Where does mycology fit in the science?
So traditionally, it's been, the study of fungi has taken place in dusty corners of plant sciences departments, because it was only in the 1960s that fungi won their independence, taxonomically speaking, and became their own kingdom of life. Before that, they were seen as a subdivision of the plant kingdom. And so that meant that there weren't university departments to study fungi, even though they are an entire kingdom of life, as we now know. And it meant that there's a kind of entrenched disciplinary bias. It restricted access to funding. There were fewer people to study these organisms. It's one of the reasons why we know comparatively little about the fungal world. And thankfully, this is changing. And now that we have, now that it's very clear that this is an entire kingdom of life and deserves all this attention, but things change slowly. I don't expect that we'll see departments of fungal science popping up, because I think the trend is more towards integration of these disciplinary specialities. It's a very 19th century thing, have the different building for each professional specialization. but it means that it's hard to form these interdisciplinary collaborations. It's hard to study symbiotic relationships, for example, because you'd have to form a daring disciplinary leap between the zoology department and the botany department, for example. So yeah, hopefully we're going to see some more attention given to fungi, and we are seeing quite a lot of attention growing in the fungal world.
And a lot of that has been driven by citizen scientists, hasn't it? Can you talk about your interaction as a scientist with the citizen scientists who have been doing a lot of this work?
Yeah, so there's certainly in the States where I went to spend time with these radical mycologists, as I call them in the book, based on this organization called Radical Mycology. And so there are, because so much of mycology has been forced into the hands of amateurs, simply because there weren't always institutional places to pursue this kind of work. And there's a very rich scene made up of people interested in permaculture, gardening, farming, sustainable farming, say traditional Chinese medicine, alternative medicines, DIY magic mushroom growers who are interested in cultivating fungi and devised all sorts of new ways to cultivate fungi in easy kitchen sink kind of ways. And so this whole bustling scene really has been, is a kind of subculture, and it's really been growing over the last 3-4 decades. And so this is in quite an active and productive state right now. It's starting to spread across the different countries. And it's an interesting thing because in this world, unconfined by academic boundaries and borders, there's a great sense of freedom and exploration. There's limits, of course, because people don't always have access to equipment or training in the use of certain techniques. But there's a sense of wild exploration and wild proliferation of ideas. And it's a very fertile movement. And it's really, I think, a good thing for mycology to have this as a really solid grounding in the amateur. The amateur, of course, that word comes from the Latin to love. And you really get this feeling when you're talking with these people.
And are there bridges forming between the science community and the radical mycologists?
Absolutely, yeah, and more. And I mean, it depends on the exact topic, but more and more the radical mycology community are being trained, learning what would have been unthinkable techniques to pursue in an amateur context even 5 years ago. And so there's a kind of there's a leakage of these techniques out of the academia into the hands of these radical mycologists, which allow the radical mycologists to participate in certain discourses, using, for example, DNA sequencing, and to enter more and more into these realms that would have been restricted to those with their own professional labs before. And then there's more and more citizen science projects where academic scientists are recruiting the help of citizen scientists to do certain types of data collection, for example, which would just be impossible with, you need an army of dedicated amateurs to do so, because there's just so much on the ground attention required.
That's fantastic. Look, I mean, that's certainly a type of symbiosis, I suppose, because you've got the symbiosis of the scientists and the citizen scientists, and symbiosis is the key word with fungi as well, isn't it? That's what they do well, is they have symbiotic relationships and flexible relationships. And one of the questions that I think your book brings up really well is, where does the self end and other begin? And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about your kind of musings on the idea of the end of selfhood as presented to us by fungi.
It's such a big question, and it's becoming clearer, fungi or no fungi, that what we think of as an individual is it's a human category that we impose for the sake of our human discussions and human systems of ordering and classification. And that's all very well, and it does useful work for us as a concept. But it's very hard when you start looking in the biological world to work out what is an individual after all. And if you start with ourselves, and we start with these trillions of bacteria that live in and on us, fungi live in and on us, they guide our development, they shape our immune systems, they change our behavior. And without these organisms, we would not behave and grow as we do. And so we carry around more of these cells than our own cells. And even within our own cells, we have mitochondria, these cellular organs which produce energy. And these were once bacteria, which have become domesticated a very long time ago. So we ourselves are these nested relationships. We ourselves are walking ecosystems, let alone plants who have fungi living in their shoots and in their leaves and in their roots. And then these fungi have bacteria living inside them. Big bacteria have smaller bacteria living inside them. Bacteria have viruses inside them, so do fungi. Large viruses can have small viruses inside them. The story of life is a story of, as Lynn Margulis, the visionary biologist, said, the long-lasting intimacy of strangers. And so, given that this is the case, this is the default position, we have to ask ourselves, at what level do we want to engage? And do we want to think about the individual bacteria in our gut? Or do we want to think about the human individual? Or do we want to think about this group of humans as a kind of cultural and social individual unit? I mean, it's just up to us. Where do we pitch that?
It's all about relationships, really, isn't it? And you described those relationships with a section on lichens, which I didn't know that I wanted to know that about lichens, but I'm fascinated by them now. Can you talk a bit about what lichens are for the people who don't know?
Mm-hmm. Lichens are symbiotic organisms, and they're formed of a fungus, or more than one fungus, with a photosynthetic partner, or more than one photosynthetic partner, which can be an alga, or it can be a photosynthetic bacteria. And these organisms come together and they form an organism quite unlike any of the constituent parts. It's a bit like the element of hydrogen and oxygen, two flammable gases, coming together to form the water molecules. And this is a molecule with properties quite unlike its constituent components. So lichens are similar. And they're amazing organisms because they're these symbiotic icons. Was the study of lichens, through the study of lichens, that this word symbiosis was coined in biology to describe the living together of organisms, this intimate sharing of bodily space. In a way that didn't, before this word symbiosis was coined, that the sharing of bodily space meant either parasitism or disease. And so there was no way to conceive of, within biology, this constructive living together, a living together that could be in some sense mutually beneficial, that could give rise to a long-lasting productive partnerships. And so once we had this word, once lichens had become these gateway organisms to this concept of symbiosis, then these other symbiotic discoveries were made, corals, for example, or plants and mycorrhizal fungi. And so lichens became a biological principle, a principle of interrelation, a principle of symbiotic living. And they've really catalyzed a lot of biological thinking. And so they do so many things for us, but that's one of them.
And of course, that these are things that exist better together than they do separately. So it's the idea that that they come together and perform better in symbiosis than they do individually. And I was also really interested to find out that that fungi can pair up with different, like if you take them apart, you can almost have their component parts separated, and that they can pair up with something different then, perhaps.
Yeah,
so that was my mind.
Yeah, it's wild. This is quite recent research where researchers at Harvard, they got free-living fungi and free-living algae, ones that had not previously formed lichens, and they grew them together in a certain context, in a certain conditions, where each could do something that the other couldn't do on their own. And this was really important. But so provided each could do something that the other couldn't do on their own, they formed these new relationships within about 10 days. They happened at a drop of a hat. So these organisms can come together, can invent a new way to live together in less time than it takes for a scab to heal. These weren't the elaborate lichens that we see growing on rocks and gravestones, on trees, on roofs, but they were nonetheless, it was the birth of a new symbiotic relationship, and it happened with different types of fungi, different types of algae. All that was needed was just for each to be able to do something the other couldn't do on their own. And so it's a really beautiful lesson about how so much of life works, and that it doesn't actually take millions of years for these things to form.
You talk about the tree and fungi relationship, and the what they call the wood wide web. And there's actually a beautiful, I don't know if people can see this map of how this particular forest kind of connects through the mycorrhizal fungi, which you've included in there. It's incredibly complex, and that's just part of it. Can you talk us through a little bit about the discovery of this kind of relationship? What do fungi do with trees and plants? What do they do with them?
So the story starts about 500 million years ago, when plants' ancestors, algae, these freshwater algae, were washing up onto the soggy shores of lakes and rivers. And when they got onto land, which was fairly scorched and barren, not much life on land, they were faced with a number of very serious challenges. And one of these challenges was, how did they forage for nutrients in the soil, in the freshwater environments? They're floating in nutrient broth. They really don't have to work too hard to get that to work out for them. But on land, they have a new type of challenge. And fungi are very deft rangers in these soil media, as we've discussed. They can burrow into these environments. They can explore with these flexible networks. And so right at the beginning of this relationship, these algal ancestors of plants and fungi struck up a relationship, and fungi behaved as their root systems for 60 million years, until plants could evolve their own root systems. So roots followed fungi into being, and today 90% of plants depend on these relationships with these what we call mycorrhizal fungi, myco from fungus, rhiza from root. And these fungi still engage in trading relationships with plants. The plant supplies them with energy containing compounds that it produces in photosynthesis, like sugars. And the fungus supplies the plant with nutrients like phosphorus or nitrogen, or water indeed. And so both enable each other, both depend on each other. And really, we can think of plants as algae that have evolved to farm fungi, and fungi that have evolved in turn to farm algae, and both farm each other. There's a kind of intimate reciprocal dependence. And so when we get into the wood wide web stuff, when you're outside in a bustling, unconfined ecosystem, then you can have a fungal network is promiscuous. It can connect with more than one plant, and plants are also promiscuous, connect with more than one fungus. And so you have shared, overlapping networks of fungi connecting plants together. And this is what's termed the wood wide web. And through these networks between plants, nutrients can pass, water can pass, and signals can pass. And so yeah, this is the concept of the wood wide web.
It's fantastic. I mean, just the idea that everything is so intimately connected, and also that humans are connected into that web in our own way as well. So fungi do connect us to the rest of the world. And I think they do that you talk about it happening in several different ways. One of them is, you know, a relationship with medicinal, with medicine, which is really important, and that we rely on fungi for medicine. And you talk a bit about a Neanderthal with a toothache.
Yes, it's a fairly recent discovery when researchers were analyzing the tooth plaques of some Neanderthal skeletons found in Spain, and there were a few Neanderthals there. One of them had a tooth abscess. They could tell that because of the the rot in the tooth. And this individual had been eating, as his tooth plaque revealed, a penicillin mold, a penicillin producing mold. And the other ones hadn't been. So this implies that this Neanderthal individual had been medicating themselves, implies a knowledge of the medicinal properties of these molds. And it suggests that the knowledge of fungi as food and medicine goes back a very long time, not just as mushrooms, which are the most ecologically apparent form of fungi, but even as molds.
We talk a lot here in Australia about the loss of a lot of traditional knowledge that has happened because of the disruption of culture. And yet, in your book, you mentioned that there's Australian Aboriginal people have been known to use fungi for medicine as well. So I assume that this is traditional knowledge that has been used around the world in different countries as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Lots of cultures have used mold through history. And it was only in 1928 that Fleming discovered the curative properties of penicillin, but it was definitely not the first instance of humans using molds as medicine. And you see this happening all over the world in many different cultures.
And of course, you touched on the idea of psilocybins before, and the idea that magic mushrooms are something that humans have connected with to help to connect us with the mystical, the idea of an interconnectedness of nature. And you talk about the scientific research into psilocybins. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, there's this very exciting renaissance going on in psychedelic research. Of course, human history it goes back a long way. The human use of psychoactive psychedelic substances is very ancient, and people have known about the value of these substances for a very long time. But thankfully, modern science is catching up. And in the 50s and 60s, as many people know, there was a huge burst of interest in these chemicals, what they could do to our minds, how they could change the way we experienced our minds and our bodies, and the potential to teach us something about how the mind worked. So in the research community, these were seen as kind of miracle cures for a whole range of psychiatric conditions. And then there was a backlash. They were made illegal. This research was shut down. And so psychedelics then sort of bubbled away underground for a while. And thankfully, in recent years, last 20 years or so, there's been a burst of new research into the effects of these compounds on our brains, on our minds, on our experience, and the potential for these compounds to solve many of our pressing problems. And so this is quite well reported. I'm sure many people will have heard of these experiments. But for example, giving people a dose of psilocybin, people with terminal diagnoses and severe anxiety, a sort of existential dread, depression, and one experience with psilocybin in a controlled environment, safe, feeling safe with trained professionals on hand, and people can have a very transformative experience. They can come to terms with the fact that they're dying. It can alleviate their anxiety, alleviate the depression. And these experiences, these psychedelic experiences, seem to loosen the rigid habits of our minds, to allow us to experience in new ways, to get out of ruts of thinking, of feeling. And so in treating addiction, in treating depression, a number of these human conditions which come about through the sort of calcification of mental pathways, the hardening of mental habits, psychedelics seem to really help. There are a number of other ways that they seem to help as well, but that's perhaps the most well reported.
We will go to questions from the audience in 5 minutes, but just before then, I just wanted to ask a little bit about fungal intelligence and the use of mazes to try and work out how they think.
Yeah, it's fun. The mazes are they're great studies because we're familiar with maze experiments. Mazes have long been used to assess the intelligence of organisms, whether they're humans or rats or octopuses. But to give maze tests to organisms without brains, I think it's a very elegant way to coax us into some new ways of thinking, because if these organisms like fungi, for example, or slime molds are another good example, they're not true fungi, they're kind of amoeba, but they live network lives, and they can do these maze challenges very well. And so fungi can find the shortest path between exit and entrance in the labyrinth, and they can do this without a brain, and they have these very efficient space searching strategies. And it makes sense, really, because these fungi are maze-dwelling creatures. They live their lives confined in complex micro-environments, exploring, changing their shape all the time as they range through this soil wilderness, or the wilderness of a rotting log, for example. And so studying the way that these organisms can navigate mazes, these simple clinical mazes, and there must be a doddle for the fungus. This is nothing compared to what it has to deal with every day on a moment-to-moment basis, just to manage its meal. But it's helping us to deepen and expand our notions of intelligence. And classically, we've thought about intelligence in humans terms. We've used humans as a yardstick by which to assess the intelligence of all other organisms. And if those organisms don't look like us or behave like us, then they've passed us by, or they fall into the bottom of the big intelligence league tables. And so there's an exciting change in the air, and these concepts of intelligence are being applied to all sorts of organisms. And it's really opening up debate in biology, and it's a welcome change.
Look, this book is everything, really. You talk about you change our minds, just like the fungus change our minds. You talk about how the future can be influenced by fungus, how our building techniques can be influenced by fungus. It also makes me feel quite positive for the first time about things like climate change, because there are ways forward and options for us to take. And that's one thing about mycologists, I think, is that they certainly are a more happier bunch than other scientists who are dealing with climate change, because there's something that can be done. There's actually positives that can come out of it. I mean, this book has, it's got everything. It's got zombie ants. It's got ant colonies that farm fungus. It's got the idea that perhaps we have been farmed by yeast production. It's an amazing book. I congratulate you on it, because I was enthralled. Every sentence is fantastic. And the way you weave in the arts and quotes from other fiction as well was really fantastic. But I could talk all evening, but I actually want to bring the audience here, and Emma Kate might have some questions. So thank you very much for this, Merlin.
It's been
my pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, Krissy and Merlin. We certainly do have some questions. We've got more coming in now. So I'm going to start, as promised, with a question from Amanda, who got in immediately as soon as the event began. She says, I bought both covers of your book, Merlin. I'm wondering if there's any chance that we'll get an audio of your book. I love listening to you read excerpts.
Oh, there is an audio book which I read, but I'm not sure why it's not available there.
Okay.
It's available everywhere else. So there's the one audio book, and it's in America, it's in England. It should be available there, but I just don't know how the audiobook distribution works.
The audiobook was delayed, so we only just got the audiobook now. So I have actually listened to you read it as well as reading it.
Okay.
Lovely. Okay, so it is out, Amanda. It's here in Australia now as well. So Lincoln, I'm just going to quickly scroll through. I have another great question here from Lincoln first. Merlin, who have you learnt the most from, or who do you admire for their teachings, whether that be other mycologists or from other disciplines?
That's a good one. There are lots of people whose thought has really influenced me. Let's see. Donna Haraway, for her unrelenting focus on kin and relationships. she talks about the smallest unit of analysis in biology being the relationship. And she's worked tirelessly on this theme for many years. And she's brilliant. And Natasha Myers is an anthropologist in Canada, and she's done amazing work with thinking about the ways that humans explain things with their bodies, how molecular biologists explain protein folding using their bodies and moving their bodies and feeling the contortion of their bodies, and really trying to think through the way that humans don't just use their brains to do science. And I found that very helpful. And she also talks a lot about the way that the sort of erotic encounters between plants and their pollinators. And who else has been helpful? Gosh, there are so many. Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who is a Brazilian anthropologist, who talks about Amerindian cosmologies and how they, and he uses these Amerindian cosmologies to decenter our Western modern views, and to lead us into a more diverse metaphysical world where there are many ways, many worldviews can coexist. He's been helpful. So many. That's a start.
Thank you. A couple of people have asked whether fungi are a kingdom at risk of becoming endangered or extinct at any point. Can you answer that?
Mm-hmm. So it's a whole kingdom of life, and so there are so many ways to be a fungus, and but this is an old kingdom of life, and fungi have persisted through all 5 of the great extinction events on this planet, and they've done so by being flexible, inventive, collaborative. And so as we enter the 6th extinction, this is a really, I mean, it's in full swing, but this is an important question to ask. When the asteroid came, and the asteroid that produced the sort of apocalyptic conditions that killed off the dinosaurs, the KT extinction, many forests were, almost all the forests on the planet were wiped out. And so Earth became a kind of giant compost heap. And so decomposing fungi thrived because these are ideal conditions for a decomposing fungus that feeds off dead plant matter. But for the fungi that live with plants, that need living plants to survive, this would have been a disastrous situation. And I think we're going to see something similar moving forward. So you're going to see some fungi that thrive in this chaos, thrive in destruction and turbulence and change, and we're going to see fungi that really don't thrive and will go extinct along with the partners that they depend on.
Thank you. Tom says there are millions of species of fungi on the planet, most of which are not formally named. When do you think we'll have a full catalogue of all of these, and does it matter to make this catalogue?
I don't think we'll ever have a full catalogue, and I don't think it matters that much. I mean, well, taxonomies are always incomplete. An over certainty in our taxonomic systems is usually a sign that things are about to get shaken up, and we're going to discover something that upsets the whole system, and we're going to have to revise what we think. So our taxonomies are not self-evident natural categories that exist out there. They're the way that we try and impose order on a world of fluid, continual fluid continua between different species, between different organisms, between different places, between different ways of being, and we're changing them all the time. So it's possible, if we kept along going as we are right now in our current way of doing taxonomy, I don't think that we'd be able to catalogue all these species of fungi. There's just not enough time to do so. And what's more, the systems of taxonomy we're using to do so are just not really capable of getting to grips with this fungal diversity. And so I think we'll probably see some changes in the way that we go about our taxonomy. It's already starting to happen with DNA, using DNA evidence rather than morphological traits. And these taxonomic systems are already starting to be revised. So yeah, we'll get to grips with more of the diversity. I don't think we'll get to grips with all of it. And I don't think it matters that we don't get to grips with all of it, because we've come this far without having full grasp of all the animals on the planet or the plants on the planet, I think it's more important that we reevaluate our attitudes to the modern human world.
BJ has asked, how might the non-scientists among us incorporate this expansion in knowledge about fungi and symbiosis into our everyday lives?
It's a long inquiry, a big inquiry. I feel that thinking about this stuff, knowing about this stuff, changes my experience. It changes the way that I go about my life, because when I hold a plant, this is not just a plant. This is the outcome of an ancient relationship that's ongoing. And so my experience of the world has changed just from knowing about these relationships, knowing about these things, and by wanting to find out more. So to embark on this path of curiosity about these ways of being, I think, is a big one. But if you want something practical, there are lots of ways. I mean, you can growing mushrooms, I suggest to a few people, is a good way to get a feeling for these organisms. You can get mushroom kits very easily. You just spray them with water, and these mushrooms will grow in your kitchen on your shelf before your eyes. And it's a really good way into the fungal world, because you can see it, you can touch it, you can then eat them, and then you can get into mushroom cultivation if that's something that you wanted to do. Or when you're gardening, if you garden, then every time you're planting a plant, you're cultivating a mycorrhizal relationship with a plant. When you put your hands in the soil, you're touching this fungal wilderness. So you can think about fungi when you're outside. You can also go around looking for mushrooms in the woods, and that's a major activity, and it's something that really connects people with the fungal world, changes the way that you see, changes the way that you experience the forest. People talk about putting their eyes on. Mushroom hunters talk about, I haven't got my eyes on yet, and it's this way. It actually changes your way of seeing and change when you become aware of these different organisms operating in a different way, to the way that we normally operate. So there are so many ways in, and whether you want something more experiential or more mind-based.
That's we've got a couple of people asking when you're coming to Australia so that they can go on a mushroom hunting with you, Merlin.
Gosh, I don't know.
Kath asks, do you think there is a smartest or most intelligent fungi?
I think there are fungi that are more intelligent than others. For example, the species that form longer-lived networks that roam over larger distances. So some of the wood-rotting species form longer-lived networks that are more exploratory. Some types of mold, they land on a piece of food, they'll grow to consume that food, but they won't explore beyond that source of food. They won't range outwards looking for more food. So I think they have fewer options. They do less, they explore less, they have smaller bodies to manage. But when you have these networks that roam out from their source of food, exploring their environment in a very, it is much more expansive foraging behavior with much larger bodies to manage, much more sensory experience to process. I think these are more intelligent fungi because they have more options, they have more to do, they have a more challenging cognitive existence.
Thank you. We've got lots more questions, but unfortunately I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to stop at 2 more, if that's okay with you both. Marilyn has asked if you could talk a little bit more about your time conducting research in Panama for us.
Yes, so I was working at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, which is a very amazing place where you can be in the forest and then be in a lab with a -80 freezer and liquid nitrogen within just a few minutes. And so lots of people go to this institute to conduct research because it's one of the few places in the tropics where you have both great facilities and great access to these ecosystems. And it was a really exciting place to be because there were so many different researchers doing such different things. There are people who followed the monkeys. There are people who studied the swimming behavior of ants. There are people who studied the way that beetles navigated with the stars. There are people who studied the way that bumblebees navigated the forest. And there's this sense of excitement, because I realized there that when the lab biologists, people who are biologists working in labs, they did their life usually outside the flasks or bottles or tubes that contain the fragments of life that they're studying. They're a kind of God figure, totally in control of the environment, totally in control of this life. But when you're a field biologist, you're inside the tube, you're inside the test tube, the flask, because you're in the ecosystem and you don't have that control. And so trees fall, destroy your experiments. You can't change the weather. It comes and sinks the boat that you need to get over there with. And so there's a sense of humility that seeps in this, to these field biologists and these environments where field biologists are all working and talking with each other. So I had a really a marvelous time there I was studying these relationships between fungi and plants, and the way that their relationships changed in different nutrient environments.
Thank you. And the last question that I'd like to finish on is, an audience member has asked about the promotional material that they must have seen for the book, where your book is covered in mushrooms. So can you talk about that? And maybe just explain what that is for anybody who hasn't seen it as well. Although they can see it via that link that I've just posted in our chat box as well, if you want to watch the video.
So I grew mushrooms out of my book, and then I ate the mushrooms that grew on the book as a way of eating my words. And it was a way we can become so abstracted when we're talking about ideas somewhere. When we're talking about the living world, you spend all your time in front of a computer screen, and then these words get printed, and then this book shows up. And I wanted to counteract this sort of tide of abstraction that's all pulling me further and further away from the things I'm talking about. It's kind of inevitable, but I wanted to join the circuit by feeding the book to the fungi and then eating the fungi, and to firmly resituate the book within the metabolic cycles that I was discussing in the book, to put it firmly back in the world, and to put me firmly back in the story of its decomposition within the world. So it was a way of reconnecting.
Lovely.
That's fantastic. And I'm going to go off and eat my now.
Wonderful. They are delicious.
And it smells good. Just as I cut it, I got this incredible waft of mushroomy smell.
It's like lobster.
Yeah. Oh, I'm looking forward to it. That's going to be great. And I hear it's very good for your brain and your neural pathways as well.
Very good. Very good.
I think mushrooms are definitely a way forward for us as a society that has, worked very hard to wiping ourselves out over the last little while. And I feel like there's a turn. It does feel like there's definitely a movement happening, a turn happening, and people are beginning to see that using fungi, we can move forward into a much cleaner, safer future. And your book has led the way, Merlin. So thank you so much for this. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And I think that Emma Kate might be able to unmute people so that they can give us a final clap.
Yeah, thank you so much, Merlin and Krissy. This has been really wonderful. We've got so many great comments coming in through the chat box and loads of people thanking you both. So yep, as Krissy said, I'm now going to unmute you all, and so that you can join me in thanking Krissy and Merlin for this fantastic discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you all for joining, and have a lovely rest of the evening.
I'm not in a short period of time.
Good night, everybody.